Hello, and welcome to Benyo Chats. If you're curious about the world, this show is for you. How do you put a price on life? Should we? On this episode, I speak to Jonathan Wolff. We discuss how he has applied his philosophical thinking to public policy and what disability studies has taught him. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe as it helps others find the podcast. Thank you. Enjoy. Hey everyone, I'm super excited to be talking to Jonathan Wolff. Joe is the Alfred Landecker Professor of Values and Public Policy. His work is one of the few in philosophy that I've been following for the last 20 years or so, and I'm really happy to be speaking with him. Joe, welcome.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure to be with you, Ben.
Great, so I'm going to start easy. So how do you value a human life? When is this something that economics or philosophy should answer or not? I asked this because I first came across your work in healthcare as a background to how the NHS was thinking about paying for health budgets. And it was thinking of these concepts of quality adjusted life years, or in the parlance, they're kind of called QALYs. And I thought, wow, of course, philosophy should have something to say about what we would call distributive effects of justice under limited budget constraints and things like that. And when I was reading your paper, I think you co-authored with Shepley Orr, I came across this work of this idea of road building, and how when people are thinking about roads and statistical life, they would offset the benefits of a new road against the loss of life from road accidents, amongst other things. And that was a kind of very eye-opening cost-benefit analysis. And it always got me thinking about, well, when do you do that? What is a statistical life? Why a lot of the times it might feel uncomfortable or not. So I guess that's my first question is, how do you value a human life, and when should we and when should we not?
Yeah, well, it's such an interesting issue because if you approach it as a philosopher or a theologian, you think somehow, to quote Kant, human life has a dignity, not a price. And the whole idea of putting a price on life is unethical. It's maybe even unethical to raise the question. And so when I first came across these ideas, I was very shocked. I think most of us are, if you try to equate life with a monetary value. So everything depends on the purpose for us in the context. And so I first came across it when I was asked, this must be more than 20 years ago. Sadly, almost everything in my life is more than 20 years ago, but this was more than 20 years ago, when I was asked to look at questions about railway safety. So what was happening was that the railways in the UK had recently been privatized, and there had been a small number of accidents that involved not enormous numbers of death, but a significant number of people dying. And this was turned into a type of national scandal, that the railways were regarded as somehow dangerous. They were negligent in regard to safety and so on. And this hit the railway industry quite hard. This type of criticism hit them very hard, because they didn't want to be regarded as negligent about safety. They wanted to be doing a good job. They wanted to be trusted. And if you look at the numbers of deaths on the railways in a year, it's actually tiny if you think about passenger deaths. So at the time I was doing this, there were probably around about, on average, most years between about 5 and 20 passenger deaths a year on the railways, compared to, at that time, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 deaths on the road. So the railways statistically were very safe, but they had this reputation for being dangerous and negligent about safety. And there was a movement to try to criticize the railways for their negligence. There were these high profile train crashes, Ladbroke Grove, people might remember, Potter's Bar. We actually remember the name of railway accidents. It's amazing. Though, 3 or 4 people died, but these are part of our national story now. And so I was asked by someone who was a former student if I would come and think about with them about the ethics of railway safety. and how do you approach safety making on the railways? Because after one of the crashes at Ladbroke Grove, John Prescott, I think it was Home Secretary, said that no, there's no limit to the value you should put on a life. There's no limit to how much you should spend to save a life. And yeah, as long as you're not thinking very clearly, you can agree with that very easily. No, there shouldn't be any limit to how much we spend to save a life. But then if you think, well, what does that mean in practice? Does that mean that we should never do anything that's risky? Because even walking to work, I risk sort of knocking someone off the pavement and into the path of a car. They say anything I do, the most innocent thing I do, has some risk for others. So really, we could say, well, we want to make the world as safe as possible, not take any risks. Then we shut everything down. Well, we can't do that. We'd all die. If we didn't take any risks, we'd all die, right? Equally, if we wanted to eliminate deaths on the railways, it's very easy. We close the railways. Then we won't have any railway deaths. Okay, but we pay in other ways. So really, we're thinking about what are we prepared to give up to save lives, and what are we not prepared to give up to save lives? So at the moment, a lot of local authorities are introducing 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in parts of the city. Yeah, if they reduce them to 10 miles an hour, there'd be almost no deaths on the road if cars drove at 10 miles an hour. But we're not prepared to do that. We think it's too high a price. And then if we're thinking about road building or railway track building, you can always build more and more safety into any system. You can always make it safer and safer, but you'll slow things down and it will cost more. And so at some point, we will say it's just unreasonable to do that additional thing. And that's when the economists can move in, because they say, okay, we've got a trade-off here. You've accepted we're going to put some sort of limits on safety. We're not going to pay for absolute safety. So what benefits do we want? And you might say, well, you know, if it took everyone 5 hours to get to work, that would be too much. And they'll say, okay, well, let's put a monetary value on that 5 hours it takes you to get to work. And we can start thinking about monetary values. Because as soon as you start talking about trade-offs, it's much more convenient to talk about money. And particularly when you're talking about actually spending money to save lives, then you have to talk about money. So to come around, you know, this is a long arc, and I'll sort of get to the punchline, which is, you know, when I was thinking about this the first time, I read these transport economists who took for granted that you should put value on life, a financial price on life, in terms of you shouldn't need, there's a limit to how much you should spend to save a life, a statistical life. We'll get to that in a moment. I read this stuff and I thought it's shocking. But then I thought, well, it's very easy to criticize, but what do I actually think instead? Do I think life has an infinite value so that we should put everything we've got into saving another life? Well, I don't think that really. Do I think it's got no value at all? Well, no, I don't think that. So I think it's got a value between 0 and infinity. So therefore we need to find a point somewhere to put it. And then it depends, a lot depends on the context. Because if you're talking about, for example, compensation in the civil law for negligent loss of life, you might put a very high value on that. So if someone installs in your apartment some central heating system they know to be faulty and it kills you, then you might think, you know, your family should have a very high level of compensation for that. But if we're talking about something like railway safety, and we're thinking of introducing a safety measure, so here's a real life example. When I was a commuter in the 1970s on a train, you could open the doors on the train while the train was still moving. And so when the train got in towards a station, we would open the doors of the train while it was still moving and jump off while it was moving. And you can't imagine probably doing that now, but that was how you just commuted. You just jumped off the train when it was still moving. It wasn't going very fast. Every year, about 20 people died through accidents of getting on and off moving trains. and the doors were very heavy. They're on a hinge. They sometimes hit passengers on the platform as well. So people died by being hit by a door. So the railway industry had to decide at some point, do they phase out these carriages? They still had some life in them. Do they phase them out earlier and bring in a new, safer carriage? So that was literally a trade-off between money and lives. So how much money do you spend in order to save 20 lives a year? And there's a very simple calculation. They spent a certain amount of money. It saved 20 lives a year. Therefore, they valued life at a certain amount. I think it turned out then it was about £8 million per life saved on their calculation. Is that too much? Is that too little? How do we know? Right. So this is where we get to the next point, really. But before we get there, notice, before we change the doors on the carriages, we don't know who's going to die. So we say we're going to save 20 lives. We don't know who those people are. It might be very different if we knew in advance who those 20 people are. So if we knew we were saving, these people whose names at the beginning of the alphabet, say the first 20 people in the alphabet, if we knew it was them and we could identify and look at them in advance, we might think we'd pay even more, maybe much more. But what it is, it's a risk that's spread over the whole population. And what we're doing is saying, how much do we pay to reduce this risk? We're making a very small reduction in risk for everyone. How much are we prepared to pay for it? That's really how the economists want us to think about this. We're not paying to save a life. What we're doing is paying to reduce the risk a tiny amount for everyone. When you put it like that, it sounds much more like an ordinary economic transaction, because you buy a cycle for your helmet, or you buy a smoke alarm, or you buy a better smoke alarm. So we're constantly making these money risk adjustments in our life. And what they're saying is, when you do it on a public policy basis, the numbers get big and it looks like you're saving statistical lives, but you're only doing the same thing on the aggregate.
That makes a lot of sense. I wonder though, and I'm really glad we have smart people thinking about this for us, is whether a lot of this is then directly applicable to health, or to what extent it does. And I think you've written about some of the exceptions where we might not use this type of thinking, sort of life or death situations or extreme situations where we don't really know a lot of the probability and statistics. I'm thinking specifically of, say, UK NHS, where I think we might spend something like £50,000, and maybe it's a little bit more now, for a QALY when we think about a quality life adjusted. And part of the thinking is, if you had to spend £100,000, you could spend that much more and save more lives at this kind of 50,000 level, particularly when you're thinking about new drugs or new inventions like that, and they can do a calculus to get that. But I think actually already in your paper, and if you ask the person in the street, there's already some inconsistencies which come up, because if you ask society, typically we are prepared to pay more, for instance, for preterm babies, which tend to have much higher, or actually these so-called rare diseases, genetic diseases, which don't affect very many people in absolute numbers, but there's no other way of saving them, and this is life there. So, and in fact, I think the NHS already produces exceptions to that, because they actually understand we're trying to reflect revealed choices in society or not. So I'd be interested to think, how well does this reflect in health and that whole public policy sphere? Have we got it philosophically broadly right, or are we applying this thinking too often, not enough, or something like that?
So interesting. So it's such a fast moving landscape, and there are so many debates going on. So I don't pretend to be absolutely up to date with all of the literature coming out now, but the starting point is any of these schemes, any public policy scheme is very easy to criticize, because everything is a compromise. And so if things are a compromise, that means there are objections, roughly speaking. And if you're just pushing one of the objections, that's very easy. It's more sympathetic, maybe more intellectually responsible in a way, to put yourself in the position of the person making the decisions, or put yourself in the position of the official. So here you are now, you're the head of the Department of Health, and you have this budget, it's an incredible budget of God knows what it is this last year, but it's been around about 110 billion or something in previous years. So it's a vast budget. and you have to spend it somehow. And so, what principles are you going to use to spend that money? And the thing that would occur to you first is you want to get the best value for money. You've got the money, you want to get the best value. What is the best value? The most health and the fewest deaths, most likely. And if you can reduce that to a single formula, like a quality adjusted life year, then you can say, well, what we should do with our money is maximize the quality adjusted life years we can get. So this means making as many people as healthy as possible. But as soon as you say that, you realize there are all sorts of exceptions that come up to it. So, for example, one of the things that is much discussed is if you are already disabled, then according to the calculations, you're only capable of a low level of health. And so if there's an organ available for transplants, and there's someone who will be restored to full health and someone who will continue to be disabled after they have that transplant, you'll get more health for your money by giving the organ to the person who can be restored to full health than the person who will be restored only to a disabled health afterwards. And that just seems unjust. It's as if it's compounding an unfairness rather than doing something which is justified. So you start thinking, well, how can we adjust the formula to make it that we don't discriminate against people with pre-existing disabilities? Or should we give a lot more weight to young people or people in the middle of their years? Should we give more weight to young mothers, say? So if you think about cases where there's a cancer drug that hasn't been made available on the NHS, quite often tabloids will make a story about this. The mother with 3 kids, the NHS is too mean, too inhuman to pay for her drug, right? And you think, she should get it. Then you think, well, what about the person of a similar age who doesn't have the 3 kids? Shouldn't they get it? Should you get a drug just because you've got kids? Now, is that fair? There's so many dilemmas around fairness and discrimination that it's very hard to come to something which everyone will agree to. What a lot of philosophers have done is criticize. What they haven't done is put other proposals forward about how we should do it. I've seen a few philosophers say it's fine just to criticize. It's for other people to come up with the proposals. So I don't myself agree with that. I think that in these sorts of areas, justification is comparative rather than absolute, meaning that unless you've got a better theory, unless you've got a better way of doing it, keep your mouth shut. Really, well, not quite.
Sounds very. Didn't Wittgenstein say something similar on science theories? There's no point destroying a theory unless you've got something better to put it in place, or at least equal to compare it with.
So he may well have done that. But that's the view I take. I mean, of course, criticism is important. And you need to see what's wrong with the theory to try to prompt people to come up with a better one. That is true. But the idea you can just criticize and cross your arms and walk away smugly and thinking I've won is not very helpful in these areas, because we need a way of distributing. I mean, I think broadly speaking, I think we do need to think about cost effectiveness in health, but I think we don't do it very well because our focus is only on some novel pharmaceuticals. And that's actually a rather small part of the health budget. And it's probably not where most good is to be done. So I'm a great believer in the work of Michael Marmot on the social determinants of health. And I think most of what determines our health isn't about what drugs we get, but the way in which we live, our lifestyles, things around poverty, things around disadvantage, even status, hierarchy. These are all things that affect our health. And so if we're spending money effectively, we might want to put it in a completely different place to a health service, whether that's a difficult argument to make given how much we love the NHS and so on.
Well, I agree. Actually, there's a lot on that, which I'd come back to whether there is a good philosophy or political economic framework. I would just throw in, there's a famous quote amongst playwrights, actually, that playwrights ask questions but don't necessarily have answers, but that actually shouldn't be true of people within public philosophy or other spheres. And actually the best plays often do put in some starts of an answer. And I think your thoughts about health are quite interesting on that, because actually, if I recall correctly, drug budgeting overall is only about 5 to 10% of healthcare spend, and new drugs much smaller amount than that as well. And social determinants are a really big factor. So one study I've looked at is, again, healthcare percent of GDP, very broad thing, but the US is almost 20% healthcare spend of GDP. UK is closer to 10, but the healthcare outcomes in the US aren't so great. And actually, if you look at it, it's because the social spending, the social determinants of health in the US are much poorer. So when you put them together, you can see that some of these social determinants are very much underspent in some nations.
Yeah.
Maybe then going one step broader and thinking about COVID a little bit before maybe going back is, do we have a good political economy or philosophical framework to thinking about some of these exceptions or things like this? Because it's interesting, I read a lot of economists who actually, whether they're left, right, or up and down, broadly show that if we were to spend globally, particularly in poorer countries, on vaccination and COVID and things like that, you'd get very good returns put in monetary value or even in the value of lives. And I think you've done some work from a philosophical point of view, talking about COVID equity, that actually richer nations, not only is it in their own best interest because of comparative economics in trades, but actually there's a moral and ethical slant as well. But then when you look at a lot of rich nation governments, and presumably they are reflecting a political economy or political choice, may or may not be reflective of what they view their voting popular is. You know, a lot of nations have opted to stay within country, and you can also argue about within country whether richer or more privileged sections of society have also had better access than some of these other minority groups as well. And in fact, some countries have let kind of vaccines almost expire or go to expiry rather than ship them out to poorer countries. So I'd be interested maybe broadly what you think about that. And then actually, do you have any start of an answer for a political economy or philosophical framework that we could look upon, rather than we can critique and say, well, like you say, there seems to be a lot which doesn't fit or is wrong or doesn't feel fair. But do we have anything better?
Well, yeah, just a small question to be getting started there. Yeah, so I don't have my own overarching framework, that is for sure. And I haven't written specifically about this general idea of duty, but I can tell you what has upset me and disappointed me a lot in the last, during the pandemic. So a lot of people have criticized pharmaceutical companies for being profiteering, for denying access to life-saving pharmaceuticals. And I've often felt in the past that some of this criticism was overdone, and that the people I know personally who've been working in pharmaceutical industry are very good-hearted. They think they're saving humanity. They are upset they're getting such bad press for it. So they've, on the whole, they've gone in with the finest motives, and they're doing their best and working really hard, and are, in some cases, great saviors of humankind. So I've been relatively defensive of the pharmaceutical industry, even though it is incredibly profitable. And I thought, well, it shouldn't be as profitable as it is. There is a problem there. It should be better for access, but it was getting its act together a little bit. And some drugs for some conditions were being donated, and there was progress. But all of that now looks just like window dressing. And I'm coming around much more to the more critical standpoint. Because if there was ever a moment in history where the pharmaceutical industry should have got together as a body, the industries should have got together as a body and worked together. If the companies that are capable of making vaccines had wanted to, they could have massively increased production around the globe, and they could, I'm not saying they could have stopped the pandemic, because we never know about the next variant of concern or so on, or how effective the vaccines will be. But if the pharmaceutical companies and governments had wanted to get together and stop this, they could have done by now, or at least made it much better than it is. But they failed to do that. And there are ways in which they have been creating obstacles. So some of the pharmaceutical companies have been signing contracts, supply contracts, which would make it a breach of contract to pass the vaccines on to another country. So, you know, this is quite common in vaccine manufacturing when you have price differentials. So you sell it cheaply in one market and say you can't sell on, and you know, on the grey market, and that's fair enough under some circumstances. But at the moment, you would think that pharmaceutical companies would just want to get together and sort this out. So that's one thing. Another thing I have heard, and I'm not sure whether this is right, there's an issue now as new vaccines are being made available or want to be made available, and for the late stage of testing, because the existing vaccines are successful enough that it now seems immoral in many circumstances to try a placebo-controlled trial, that we wouldn't think it was morally legitimate to say to some people, you know, for the next year, you're not going to have access to the vaccine if you're in the control arm. So we won't sign people up for those trials. So what we need to do now are comparative trials where you look at the efficiency of a new vaccine against existing vaccines. And, you know, it's not scientifically as strong, but it's ethically better, and it's the best we can do. I have heard that some companies are not making their vaccines available for these comparative trials because they don't want to be found inferior. Because the whole purpose of these trials is to show that someone else's product is better than yours. And who, if you're a fully commercial entity, who would do that? Right? You wouldn't put your vaccine up for that comparison. Now, if you've got a good market, you've got a monopoly, why would you want, if you treat it purely from a commercial point of view, why would you want to create your own competition like this? Okay. Whereas I felt that the industry should be taking a corporate view where, i.e., there should be this thing, the pharmaceutical industry, that's trying to save us at this point, rather than there being a dozen companies that are competing each other and trying to hoard market share.
Sure. Okay, that's very interesting. I'll try and take maybe a couple of points to try and defend the industry, not that I'm sure I'm going to be very capable of it, before maybe moving on to a little bit of thinking about minorities and disabilities. That latter point does feel very unusual to me. Also, that countries could actually requisition those other vaccines for their own trials. That does seem that I would have thought that's unusual, but it could be the case that the companies are holding back those older vaccines. But I guess on the first point, without sort of putting responsibility one way or the other, part of it to me does seem to be a question fairly simply of money, that if you gave me something like $200 or $300 billion, which kind of seems like a lot, but actually which governments could pull together and have this amount quite quickly, you could do all of this. You know, factories cost in the order of $1 to $5 billion, and there's some tech transfer, but you could do this relatively easily. Now, the fact is, no one stakeholder has really stumped up this money. Even the sort of non-governmental groups which have tried to get this money are really only in the kind of looking at the very low billions, and they have some other things to do with that. So partly I have a lot of blame for everyone, in the sense that if all the rich governments had simply thrown in 10 billion into the pot, you could have done this, and you could have said pharmaceuticals, you know, they would have at least washed their faces. They could have done this in a way which would have been win-win. And I still don't quite understand why that hasn't happened, except that global good coordination is a difficult thing, which actually doesn't leave me very hopeful for climate, which we might come on to otherwise. Although the second other defense, and I do think, to almost counter myself, that there probably is something special about healthcare, but we don't necessarily argue that Apple should be giving up its iPhones, or telecoms companies should be giving up sort of mobile. You know, for instance, you could argue mobile bandwidth would be really important for some people at the moment, and there would be a positive good to that. Yet we don't kind of say, well, you should just give away that for free, and that should be fine and all right. But there is something special about healthcare, I do think, because a lot of this is life and death, which is something that you talk about. But I do think they could sort of make the case of, well, Apple and Microsoft or Facebook and the likes don't have to seemingly give up as much as we can. But I think they could well have done more, because you could have done this sort of 10 billion investment in somewhere like India, transferred your tech and got that production going. And it isn't actually, in the grand scheme of things, that large amount of money. So I don't defend them completely, and I don't know whether I apportion things, because I can actually see this as a so unlike climate, which is, there's a lot of many factors to this, there's actually only a handful of challenges that need to be overcome, and a coordination problem and some money, and we actually have the solutions to a lot of those challenges, which is kind of why I find it sort of very disappointing from both an economics point of view, because if you wanted to be very hard-nosed and monetary, this is a net benefit to everyone on money values, or the ethical point of view in terms of life saved, reputation, social capital, and human capital. So I'm kind of a little bit disappointed that this is where we've ended up, but obviously this is where we've ended up.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of that. I think I've made the distinction, not original to me, between so who has the obligation to act and who has the obligation to pay for that action. And it seems to be, the pharmaceutical companies are the only people in a position to act, to bring the pandemic much more under control. But it doesn't follow from that they have to pay. And in fact, it's you and me that should be paying through our governments, through our taxes, and so on, and maybe benefactors. So there just seems to have been a failure of leadership, that if pharmaceutical companies had got together and gone to governments and said, we will pool all our resources, but we need the 200 billion. Or the governments, and maybe it was a problem that it was President Trump, who was president of the US at the time, if governments had got together and said, look, we've got this 200 billion, you get your act together. And so it could have been solved, but it wasn't. And there was the attempt through COVAX, which has done something, but is nowhere near, as you indicate, getting there. But the point I want to make is I did some work on business ethics some years ago, and one concept that I like the look of a lot, I haven't done any work on it, is an idea of what was then called an informal license to operate. And that, of course, in most areas of business, you don't need a license to operate. You could set up, okay, you need certain licenses to show competence and safety and good character, and if you're in the casino business or something. So there are various tests you have to go through. But we don't have this idea that you have to show you're giving something back to the community or you're acting responsibly. And there are companies that act in a certain way in which you can say they've sort of lost the faith of the nation, and they've lost their informal license to operate. And I would like much more to be made of that. The thought that it's a real privilege. Well, it's great for us as consumers that there are these companies competing, and because competition brings down prices and raises quality. But at the same time, it's a great privilege for people who are owning stocks in these companies, that they can make money out of this system. So the thought is, we all owe something back. We all owe something to make the system work. And I think the pharmaceutical companies have not really lived up to their license to operate. And what determines their license to operate partly depends on the nature of the business that they're in. So if you're in the business of life, if you're making money out of life and death, then you've got a much closer connection to life and death. If you're making money out of broadband or something, then maybe you have a special responsibility for keeping the pollution down, or I don't know, that's a stupid example, but
communication open. Yeah.
Yes, space pollution, right? Making sure you monitor dangerous space objects or something. So there are certain areas that, because you're operating in that area, you have special responsibilities in relation to that area. I think we could make much more of that as a society. The type of individualism of the economy that we have makes that a much more difficult thing to force through and get across.
So I think the social license to operate idea is slowly gaining traction, but I would view it as progress is slow. The interesting thing about the circularity of it is that at the end of the day, for instance, in this country and in most of rich nations, it's you and me, the person in the street, which ends up owning a piece of these companies through our pension. And that's been very atomized. So in fact, certainly most people we meet will actually have a very small partial ownership of these very companies. So we are also profiteering and the customer, and we are part shareholder as well as stakeholder. And the fact that we could somehow use our voice and ownership to bend on that social license is only beginning to get the kind of traction that actually we have in terms of those rights, well, those rights in law, and also the exercising of those rights. So I do think that's quite an interesting thing. Maybe circling back to something that we mentioned, and I know you do a lot of work on, which is on times of minorities. I'm particularly interested in disability, because actually there is, I think, this view that perhaps the disabled human life is somehow less. There are worse health outcomes, there are worse job outcomes. You can actually observe this for a lot of other minorities. I'll stick with disability, partly as stats suggest that, for instance, in Britain, 1 in 5 people are disabled, and it's a very large minority globally. And I would be interested in what you think philosophy has had to say about this. It's partly because when I've been reading around, I kind of felt that ideas which have come from disability studies, social models of disability, even things like gender studies and the like for other things, seem to have progressed ideas here more and in a more practical way than perhaps some mainstream philosophy. I don't know, is this your reading of what philosophers have had to offer on minority in disability debates, albeit that, you know, your work and program now is kind of a lot focused on the rights of the minority in civil institutions and that, but I'd be interested in your thoughts of how we progressed on this or not in the last few decades.
Yeah, well, it's certainly got a lot better than it was. So I started working on disability round about, I suppose, about year 2000. And I can't now completely reconstruct why I did it, but I think I was giving a talk about Dworkin's theory of equality. So if you go back to, this is one of these "how long have you got" type questions, but if you go back to John Rawls in The Theory of Justice, 1971, he deliberately doesn't discuss disability. He makes it explicit. He's leaving questions of disability to one side. And he was roundly criticized for that because, as you say, it's a very significant minority. So Ronald Dworkin comes along and gives a theory of justice which does accommodate disability, but he considers disability as a deficit, that you need more money. You know, if you're disabled, you need more money. And so his approach to disability was about finding a formula to tax people who were not disabled and to transfer that money to people with disabilities. So Dworkin has a sort of tax and redistribution approach to disability. He doesn't describe it like that, but that in practice is what it was. I think I remember giving a talk on this in a multidisciplinary conference. There was someone from disability studies who was sort of sneering with contempt at this approach. I tried to explain it, and even I think I was using the word handicapped at that point, and you could see that he thought I was in the dark ages in the way I was talking. Yet this was sort of cutting edge political philosophy. And I got quite upset, sort of almost offended on behalf of philosophy here, to think that why was it that we were being so misunderstood? So I started reading around some of the work in, I bought some disability studies books and started reading. I just realized how prejudiced I was around issues of disability and how narrowly I had thought of it. So physical disability, I've always thought of as like a medical problem, and the ideal thing to do with disability was to put people in hospital and cure their disability. And so it was a real shock to me to read people who were paraplegics, who were denying they were refusing medical treatment. And partly it was because the treatment they were offered was very poor and wouldn't help. Partly it was that being in a hospital for half your life is a terrible way of spending your life. But also people were quite happy with their bodies, so they said, and they identified with how they were and they didn't want to change. I thought, well, fair enough. Why should they change? Why should anyone have to change to fit in with other people's ideas of what's normal? And so it's that idea. In a way, it's a deeper philosophical question about what is normal. And within political philosophy, we hadn't really interrogated this. So we'd assume there is this thing called being normal, and everyone wants to be normal. And if you're not normal, there's a deficit. And if there's a deficit, then from the purposes of distributive justice, you should be given some compensation for your deficit from people who don't suffer that deficit. This was a very, very narrow and demeaning and insulting and thoughtless way of handling questions of disability. There were a few philosophers who were not doing this. Anita Silvers, for example, Shelley Tremaine is another. Most of the philosophers who were dealing seriously with issues of disability were disabled themselves and found the mainstream discourse very upsetting. A few people like me who came in from mainstream philosophy wanting to think about disability and then finding disability studies much more philosophically sophisticated than the philosophy. And that was a surprise because you think, if you're a philosopher, you're brought up to think you're the most sophisticated person, you're the smartest person in the room, and you've certainly got a monopoly on philosophy. And anyone else who thinks they're doing philosophy, they're probably doing history of ideas or sociology or something. They're not doing really real philosophy. Then to find that these works were ontologically and epistemologically more sophisticated than we were doing, certainly in political philosophy, I found that a revelation. And so I've been a sort of import-export agency between philosophy and other disciplines, trying to bring in ideas from other disciplines to show how we in philosophy can learn about philosophy from reading other things. And it's not just that we've got the truth and we're somehow spreading it to others.
I find that really fascinating. I think from disability world, if I mention philosophy and disability, we inevitably run into the work of Peter Singer. And his type of consequentialist thinking of applied philosophy has actually done a lot for animal rights and animal suffering, and has also created effective altruism, so a kind of expected value as hit to things like charitable giving and the worth of a life. Yet actually when applied to this type of disabled life, has kind of at least viewed in disabled life as viewing disabled lives as lesser, as you kind of indicating, or more exactly, I think he would say, he argues that the parents of disabled babies should be allowed to end their lives. And I was wondering what you kind of thought with this. I mean, maybe it's part of the problems about this more extreme utilitarian type of thinking. And I think they have this thing like, what is it, the dismal scenario or whatever, where everyone's kind of in hell and you can make it a little bit better, but everyone's still in hell. And well, that's no good, is it? Because no one's really happy. But I was wondering that because it doesn't go down well in disability community, and it does just seem to chime a little bit differently, but from a sort of very cold expected value type of thing, I can kind of maybe get there, although it doesn't seem to chime whatsoever. I don't know. Do you think political philosophy has anything to say about that?
So I think political philosophy's got a lot to apologize for a lot of the time. And I spend my time doing that, actually apologizing on behalf of political philosophy. Now, I think I've reached a point in my career where I don't have to read things I don't agree with anymore. And I like a lot of Singer's early work. I think it's very thought-provoking. I think he's done a lot to make people think about various prejudices they've had around equality. But I haven't really paid a lot of attention to his work on disability. And I've been much more interested in the work of people like my friend Tom Shakespeare as a disabled person, just trying to work through what it's like. So Tom, earlier in his life, was not a complete defender of the social model of disability, but he thought a lot of disability was constructed, but he's changed his view as his own condition has changed. And you think, well, pain is not socially constructed. Pain is pain, and pain is a real thing. If you're living your life in pain, then there's no way of changing society where that pain doesn't matter or disappears or something. So, you know, within the disability studies community, there's a lot of thinking around, you know, what can we do if we think more creatively in society, and what can we fail to do? And, you know, for me, so much of my work in philosophy now in political philosophy comes from what I take to be sort of the central insight of the social model of disability. And so that insight is that because of the way some people are constructed mentally and physically, and because of the way the world is constructed mentally and physically, socially, culturally, some people fit into the world more easily than others, right, as things are. So there's a misfit. So disability is a type of misfit between the person and the world. So the naive assumption is we have to change the person to fit better into the world. The social model says, no, we should change the world so everyone fits in. And in a way, that's my ambition for everything. Now, when we're thinking about any type of minority, you think, well, what is the misfit here? Should we change the world so that people fit in? Now, in some cases, this is impossible or not a great idea. So, so Dan Whitler in the 70s wrote a paper called something like Paternalism and the Mildly Retarded. And he said how badly the social model works for some forms of cognitive disorder. So if you think, what would it be to rearrange the world so that having a very low IQ wasn't a disadvantage? You would have to get rid of the banking system, have to get rid of everything sophisticated. So that feels like that's too high a cost. So there are going to be limits. But just this idea of the lack of fit between the person and the world. And in some cases, we want the person to change. We want to educate people. We want to make people able to read. We want to make them numerate. In other cases, you know, if you only have stairs going into the building and you could easily put in a ramp, then you can make some people's lives a lot better, minimal effort, and there's no reason not to. If you can do that, so you change the world rather than trying to change or assist the person. And these ways, once you understand that, once you try to change the world to accommodate more people, that means things like disability become less stigmatizing, that you don't have to identify in order to be helped, for example. So this is one of the things of the type of Dworkin scheme. If it's about redistribution, you have to identify as a disabled person to claim your benefit. But if we've rearranged the world so that being a disabled person in that respect is no longer a disadvantage, then no one even has to think about it. You just get on with your life, right? So these are the things. This is the sort of inspiring vision, I think, that disability helps us think through. And you know, it's very, I normally don't like to do this sort of ideal world theory, but I think in disability cases, it's very interesting to think, now, how would we have constructed the world differently if we took people with disabilities seriously from the start? Because what we've done is construct the world for the 80% who aren't disabled and have made small adjustments around the edges for the other 20%. But if we start from the point of view that the world is a diverse place with people with different mental and physical attributes, how would we have done things differently? I think now that is a great thought experiment that can be quite inspiring for policy. So do I think a disabled life is less valuable than non-disabled life? Well, no, I don't. I think we may have constructed the world so that some lives are much more difficult for people than other lives. Some people face much more obstacles in their life than others. Certainly some people can do more than others. Certainly some people are in more pain and discomfort and lack of mobility than others. So there are differences. But the idea that, it's possible that some lives are not worth living. If they're full of pain, if they're very, very short and full of pain, then you might say that's a life that's not worth living. But beyond that, any type of life is worth living, and it's the only life that the person has got. And it seems to me that trying to grade different lives as of different values is very unfortunate. Of course, there are questions. The type of question that, say, Parfit raised was around abortion and disability. And this you mentioned yourself about whether parents have a right to, or even a duty, I suppose, in some cases, to end terminated pregnancy because of disability. Was that what you wanted to pursue?
Well, we don't have to go there in the sense that I do think we always question it, that there is a definite difference between, and I think society broadly views the same, although obviously there's debates for when you're ending the life of someone who's been born, and obviously there's debates on that versus not. And that's partly because Singer takes it all the way to when a baby is born, whereas sort of unborn is a lot more accepted to be a lot more complex. Although the sequelae is, you've got some very interesting second order effects. For instance, in Iceland currently, essentially no one is being born with Downs, because you can screen for that, and the second order effect is that doesn't happen. And a cousin observation would be in the deaf community, where you can medically lose deafness versus hearing communities, and there's an extremely rich deaf culture which is being eroded, or will likely, if you follow this, be eroded over time. And so, to extend some of your thinking, I do think it's probably the case that you can bring the world closer to a lot of these communities, at not only at no cost to everyone else, but in a way that enriches everyone much more often. But there are maybe some points, let's say, severe schizophrenia, which would be very difficult to map around. Although in isolated cases, I was reading an accounts of how people treated what we might think of as people having visionary episodes as prophets today, that we might view as having schizophrenia. And actually in some olden times, in isolated communities, they were looked after very well, and actually the world might have rotated around what visions they were having. Perhaps putting that all together, I mean, this just extends your ideas and thinking about the importance of this social model. Thinking about minorities, I think there's someone who calls himself probably more of a risk philosopher, Nassim Taleb, who's more famous for thinking around risk and black swans, but he's actually posited something about minority rule in complex systems. And this is the idea that it takes a courageous group of minority people for society to function properly. And he gives an example of a disabled person may not have access to a regular bathroom, but actually, if all bathrooms were accessible, this would be equal for non-disabled and disabled. So if that would happen to the world, it would just actually be a net positive broadly. So all bathrooms accessible, and actually your problem is solved. So perhaps interesting on extending that, I was wondering what you were doing on your work on civil society and institutions protecting minority rights, and maybe talking a little bit about your idea of a society of equals, this idea that maybe a society which avoids negatives, avoids exclusions, and exploitation is something that philosophy should be thinking more of it, because it does seem to be an extension of taking some of these social model ideas, but putting them maybe more broadly into a philosophical framework.
Okay, thank you. So this is an ongoing project of work, of course, and it goes back again to the debates I mentioned, Dworkin's work on equality. And Dworkin presented a view that came to be known as luck egalitarianism, which says roughly that we should insulate people from the results of bad luck. So if you're born disabled, that's bad luck for him. You should be compensated for that. That was part of his view. But if things are down to your individual choice, then you should bear the consequences of that. So the luck egalitarian view says an equal society is one that compensates for bad luck, but allows people to bear the consequences of their good and bad choices. Now, there are two main features of that view. One is that it gives a high premium to something like individual responsibility. So it tries to insulate you from things that are outside your own choices, but requires you to pay the costs of your choices and get the benefit of your choices. So responsibility and choice is really important. And the other thing about it is it thinks about equality in terms of distribution of resources, of goods in the world, right? And that became sort of the mainstream view in theories of equality, this type of luck egalitarianism. And there are lots of variations on it. There are lots of ways of generating debates within that framework of thinking, well, should it be resources, or maybe should it be equal happiness that we will have? Or should it be resources, or should it be opportunities for resources? There are lots of debates, lots of positions. Jerry Cohen, my teacher, took his own position. Dick Arneson took a position, many other people, John Romer. So there was a debate broadly within the same assumptions. And one of the amazing things about a set of assumptions is that no one realizes they're making them until someone points them out to them. So there was a debate that looked like these people had big differences between each other. Then there were a set of criticisms from me, but more importantly from Elizabeth Anderson, that pointed out that this whole group of views had these things in common around choice and distribution of something. And the view I was presenting at that time, and she also, and Sam Scheffler and others, and David Miller before us, then starts from this idea that if we think about what attracts us to the idea of equality, it's not really the idea of sharing something out equally between people. That the equality isn't about equal income or equal wealth or equal happiness. It's about not looking up at people and not looking down, not looking up to people and not looking down on them. Thinking of yourself as an equal with others. It could be equal respect, some people think, but it could just be the bland idea is you want to live in a society where everyone regards each other as equals. And that might have consequences for distribution, but it's not defined in terms of distribution. And so a society of equals is one which is constituted by a certain type of relations between people. And that's a basic idea. And again, you can have 1 million people writing their PhDs to try to tell us what these relations are. And so I came up with a version of this view in the late 90s. I thought, okay, so now my task is, what is this relation? What is the bond of equality? And I spent a few years trying to come up with it, didn't get anywhere. Had a couple of PhD students. I set them the task. They didn't come up with it either. They didn't solve it for me. But they did very good work, but they didn't solve it. And I sort of abandoned it. And then I was doing work around public policy. And my approach in public policy was always to start from the problem. So if you're thinking about a problem in public policy, don't just think about the policy area and think, what would be an ideal railway system? What would be an ideal system of railway safety? You start with what's going wrong with the system we've got. What are the dilemmas with the system we've got? So most like an engineer's approach, what's going wrong? How do we fix it? And I thought, well, maybe that's the right way to think about equality too. So rather than thinking, well, what would be an ideal society where everyone relates to each other as an equal? I thought, well, maybe there's not one model. Maybe there are thousands of different ways in which we could have a society of equals. So the idea that I'm going to promote one model and say, join my model, put my flag on it and say, sign up to my model of equality. It's ridiculous. No one's going to sign up to it and do it. Right? It's utopian thinking. But what we can do is look at the society we're in, think, what are the greatest and most pernicious inequalities in our society? So we've talked about disability. Most people who are writing about this are salaried employees, so they tend to think about income as something that's really important. I came to think that inequality post-employment is actually much more important than inequality in employment. So the lives of people in retirement run from extreme poverty to extreme wealth for contingent reasons like, were you lucky enough to be able to buy a house and pay a mortgage and have paid it off and don't have rent to pay? Do you have the good fortune to have received an inheritance just as you're retiring, for example, or not? Do you have a private pension, as we were talking about before? So someone like me, I'm in about as privileged position as you can be, because by the time I retire, I will have paid off my flat. I've got a pension from the USS before it all went wrong. I will inherit something, not a lot, but there'll be some things that that'll pay for my vacations in my retirement. Something whereas if I didn't have any of that, I could be living hand to mouth. So you think, okay, there are these unnoticed inequalities or there are equalities that we don't think much about. One thing I thought a lot about before was so-called benefit cheats. I've got a paper coming out on this video because we all hate benefit cheats, except who are benefit cheats? They're people who cannot survive on the starvation benefits they have and try to do something so they can buy their kid a birthday present. And not in every case, but there are people who are among the hardest working, potentially hardest working in the country, who are labeled as cheats. So you start looking at these injustices and inequalities and start thinking, well, what can we do about that? So relations like exploitation, exclusion, hierarchy, arbitrary power, violence, these are all examples of inequalities that we can address. And we don't need new philosophical theories to tell us these things are wrong, but we do need a sort of heightened perception about the ways in which our societies can be deeply unjust and the ways in which we can begin to try to address this. So the idea of a society of equals, that's an aspiration that I don't believe we'll ever get to. I think, for example, I think it's impossible, probably psychologically impossible, to eliminate hierarchies, even though they're unjust. So I'm not one of these people who think every problem has a solution. I think there are some problems that we will never solve. So I think hierarchies are unjust and inevitable, but that doesn't mean the extent of hierarchy is inevitable or the pernicious consequences of hierarchy is inevitable either. So there are going to be things we can do to mitigate it, make it softer and less problematic. So it's not exactly an inspiring vision, but the thought is that we should be attending much more carefully to the ways in which our societies go wrong and think about how we as philosophers can try to contribute to projects to help repair.
That's really fascinating. That might not be very catchy as a vision, but I actually think that form of what I would call incremental progress, or applying insights that we have or are out there, but we're not applying them as well as could be, is probably really important. And I haven't heard it articulated in the way that you have. So that is going to leave me thinking and is really valuable. So thanks. I thought we might do a short sort of overrated, underrated section where I throw out a phrase or a name, and you can pass, and then you can say overrated or underrated or why, and then end with a couple of questions. Unfortunately, we're sort of running out of time because there's so many other things I was going to ask you about, like, can you ever have responsible gambling, and how should we trust an expert, or why should we become a philosopher? And we haven't even hit on things like climate change, but I think we'll have to save those for another one. So overrated, underrated, feel free to pass or not. Direct or deliberative democracy?
Good. I thought you were going to ask me about people, and this was going to be very embarrassing.
Yeah.
Direct. So I think, so the idea of direct democracy, I think my views are changing on this. I have written that the direct democracy suffers from the defect that Oscar Wilde said about socialism, and that it would take up too many evenings, and that if we really were going to have direct democracy, we'd have to spend so much time, we wouldn't be very good at it. It's a bad idea. I haven't completely moved away from that view, but we do now have technological means to do things a lot better. We can have, my friend Annabelle Lever talked about mini publics, where you can have not everyone deeply engaged, but 1,000 ordinary citizens for a year, say, engaged in the political process. I think part of the problem is that for most of its time, political processes only draw in a small selection of the population as representatives. So, before the 20th century, pretty much everyone in Parliament was from a very narrow, male, privately educated, wealthy background. We had a few decades with the rise of the Labour Party where you had people from trade union background, people from different walks of life getting into politics. And that was maybe quite a lively era. But that now feels like something that has passed. And we're now back to a situation where almost everyone who is elected as a member of Parliament has spent a lot of time around Westminster, has been a SPAD, has been something to do with Parliament, or maybe on the Tory side in business, but has kept close to politicians. And so so the people who are representing us are a very narrow proportion of the population. And I think it would be wonderful if we could work out ways of having a much wider range of people, different experiences. Yeah, a few people with significant experience of unemployment in Parliament would be fantastic. More disabled people in Parliament or close to Parliament. So if we could have some type of much more representative system as a sort of satellite, I think that would be wonderful. So I would say, understood the right way, direct democracy, underrated, understood as it's normally understood, probably overrated.
Very fair. Okay, multiculturalism.
Wow. So multiculturalism is, so it depends what you're contrasting multiculturalism with. So if you're contrasting multiculturalism with monoculturalism, where you want to have a society where everyone is, the same background, same, well, this doesn't fit with me very well at all. I've written about how I'm descended from 3 generations of asylum seekers. So anyone of Jewish descent of my age has gotten that as a background, even if, like me, people think you're a sort of quintessential Englishman, you can have this a quite different background. So multiculturalism definitely very important in relation to monoculturalism, but more subtly, it's contrasted with policies of assimilation. And so my great-grandmother, who I never met, apparently lived in England for half her life, but only ever spoke Yiddish. So was that a good thing or a bad thing? She could only speak to members of her own very small Orthodox Jewish community. That seems to me a shame. So I wouldn't want to force assimilation, but I would want to make assimilation available. So I think multiculturalism with the right amount of opportunity for being part of a mainstream culture is important. But I think, in my own case, completely assimilated. But for people who don't want that, I think that is absolutely fine and adds to the glory of the country to have for there to be multi cultures. So I'm in favor, and in some ways I find it quite difficult to understand the opposition. It feels to me somewhat narrow and maybe rather fearful for people to think there's something wrong with many cultures living side by side.
Sure, that seems fair. Adam Smith.
Wow, Adam Smith. So what you're meant to say is Adam Smith was this defender of capitalism, so the right wing think, but actually there's much more to him than that. And if you read The Theory of Moral Sentiments, you'll find he's this other person, except people can't quite tell you what this other person is, except he's very humane and has other things going on, has a theory of the impartial spectator. A couple of years ago, I decided I was going to read The Wealth of Nations cover to cover because no one does. And when I finished it, I realize why no one does, because it's full of defenses of obsolete economic policy, which is of no relevance now, around the currency and so on, and exchange rate.
Yeah, labor and stuff.
Yeah. So the parts that people read are probably the right one, a few hundred pages or 50 pages or something. I think he is probably a much more subtle thinker than he's often taken to be. I wrote a little book on Marx, and I spent some time looking at the early writings, the economic and philosophical manuscripts. And I realized, looking at it a bit more carefully than I had done, I'm not as a scholar, not as a deep scholar, but just looking at it properly, I realized that Marx's criticisms of capitalism were pretty much all taken just from reading Adam Smith. So all of the observations that lead to Marx's theory of alienation are already there in Smith, about the commodification of labor, about the working day being punishing, about the early death. All of that is there, taken by Marx from Smith. So if scholarship had gone a different way, Smith today could have been regarded as a critic of capitalism rather than a defender. I think, from his writings. So is he overrated or underrated? It's a difficult question.
Yeah.
I think I've given my answer.
Yeah, you give him a neutral. It is true that actually he is almost certainly, in most of my reading of him, not pro big business. He's anti big business, aside from everything else, because even in his capitalist market interpretations, the tendency towards monopoly is not actually good for market competition, of which he doesn't fall into. But like you say, most people don't read him, probably for quite good reasons. Last couple, pronouns.
Pronouns. Yeah, I haven't really got my head around this. I regard, in some respects, I regard myself as a pioneer in that in my writing, I've never had a problem using the singular they. That I know for some people, it doesn't sit right for them. It sounds wrong, but it's, to my ears, the singular they has always been okay. Sometimes it's a bit forced, but normally you can rewrite the sentence so it's not too clumsy. So I've tended in my writing, as much as I can, I just tend to avoid using them. Or so you can put things in a passive tense, or you can recast things so you don't have to use pronouns. In terms of use of pronouns, I so wish we had a language which didn't have them. It would make things much easier. I believe Chinese doesn't have them, or at least
not really. Not in the same way at all. Yeah.
There's a book, I think it's Marge Percy's Women on the Edge of Time. I'm not sure, it might not be that one, but I read it when I was a teenager. And I remember in the book, she replaces the author of the book replaces pronouns with per. So instead of his, it's short from person. So instead of him and her, you just have per. So per says. I think that's great. If we had done that, life would have been so much simpler for us. So I think this is my way of saying I would like to avoid the questions of pronouns rather than come down some way. But is there something particularly behind your question that I've missed?
Well, I guess very tangentially, I'm thinking a little bit. Amir Srinivasan, who I guess is also a philosopher at Oxford, wrote a extended sort of essay in the London Review of Books and things. And I guess there's been a movement, particularly around identity, with this fight around it, which actually your commentary about having something which had a different language would completely sidestep. But the thinking of that has evolved, or is more evolved, and I'm still finding my way as to what it all really means, and that's why I thought I'd throw it out to a philosopher. But that's a perfectly adequate response. Cryptocurrencies.
Yes. So I'm not in an expert position here. I have not put my money in cryptocurrencies, but then that's partly because I don't have any money to put anywhere. So that's neither here nor there. I keep expecting them to crash. But of course, even if it's a pure bubble, there's lots of money to be made if you get your timing, if you're lucky with your timing. I'm not sure there's such a thing as calculating the timing right, because these things are so random. Some people have made an absolute fortune. I no doubt there are some people who have lost a fortune and not telling us either. I don't know. I mean, I think before COVID, I thought I had an understanding of how economies worked. And on my basis of how economies worked, if we went into lockdown for a few months, everything would grind to a halt. And it turns out I was completely wrong. We went into lockdown and we lost a few points of growth, probably. And most things carried on, and we seem to be able to introduce unconditional basic income at a very high rate without doing any harm. Okay, we borrowed money, or we printed money, or whatever we've done. But what I've come out of this realizing I know nothing about how the economy works. So
well, that's good. So supposedly a lot of macroeconomists fight with one another because none of them understand how the economy works either. So that's the joke. I guess I was slightly hinting at the nickname, or the affectionate nickname, would be crypto bros, and a lot of crypto bros argue that some form of cryptocurrencies are a kind of decentralized libertarian view of trying to do an economy rather than a kind of regulated, a central bank way of doing an economy. So some people would very much associate it with a kind of libertarian worldview, to simplify things, you know, dramatically, versus a regulated worldview. But it's but I do think you're probably right. Most people are just in it because it seems to go up and down a lot, and therefore you can agree or not. Okay, last couple would be well, these are more sort of, I guess, the questions, which would be, one is any thoughts on the future of the city, and another is just a strand of your work I picked up on the philosophy of music performance. So you can feel free to comment on either or not.
I got a project at the moment about equality in the city, and how paradoxically some of the cities that we regard as feeling most equal come out on indices as very unequal. So Berkeley, for example, in terms of, you know, you have people in absolute poverty and multi-billionaires living there. So by some measure, that's very unequal. But if you're an egalitarian, that's a city you want to live in. So, but that wasn't your question. Your question was about the future of the city.
But true, I mean, the future city viewed through a lens of equality or that sort of work is equally interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a cycle, isn't there, going on in that at the moment we're seeing people reassessing whether they need big office space and encouraging people to work from home, and maybe downsizing the offices, and people won't be coming in. And that and so those offices are then being converted into apartments, and you know, this seems nice, you can come and live in the city. But at the same time, a lot of the reasons for living in the city might be disappearing. So if everything turns into an apartment and, you know, there's nothing else other than apartments, you've just got this big dormitory. So I think, you know, so it's an ecosystem. The city is an ecosystem, and one type of change will have other types of change as well. I think what people are attracted to is a sense of liveliness, and if that disappears, so if the businesses aren't here, so the restaurants close and the bars close and the cafes close and the little gift shops can't stay, then they're not going to feel the same, and there may be less reason, but then people might move out and probably get cheaper and new types of business move in. So I think this has happened in the past where things have gone in waves. You have a wave of gentrification, but then maybe you have a wave of abandonment for whatever reason, and then you have re-gentrification. So I think, yeah, I don't think the city's going anywhere at the moment. I don't think the city's disappearing. They're getting bigger and bigger. But we are in an inflection point where house prices in the countryside are going up more than in the city, much more. And you know, 3 or 4 bedroom house with a garden that you might not have been able to sell a few years ago now is a prime property, and so on, to exaggerate. But I'm not very good at telling the future. I'm not very good at even thinking about what it's going to be like next year anyway. So I'm not going to try to be a futurologist.
Fair enough.
Music performance. Yeah. So the work I did here, so it's very narrow work. I've got a friend who's a music therapist, and he's been working with. He was a professional musician, still is a very, very highly accomplished musician, and he was a music producer as well. And I've seen him, you know, with kids of friends, to just go in a room, and an hour later they come out with a very polished track that the kid has written. So the kid didn't know they got any music or talent, and he, you know, 2 hours later they've got something that sounds like a professional recording. And he does it by, and it's their work, not his work. So he's giving them technical assistance and musical assistance, but he's building on their ideas and their lyrical ideas and their musical ideas. And he's been doing this with people with mental health problems, and some with very complex mental health problems, even to the point where some people won't communicate by speech and just send in texts even when they're sitting next to him. But even so, he's managed to get a very high standard of musical performance from many of the people he's worked with. And what it's done, it's increased their self-confidence, it's given them something tangible, and it's connected them to family and friends. And I just think this is a really fascinating way in which it's a really interesting example of type of relational autonomy, in that they're being autonomous, but their autonomy depends on another person to bring it out, and it depends on a social context to bring it out. So it shows, at least in some contexts, autonomy is not a sole individualistic matter. It depends on the people around you, which is something that feminist philosophers have been arguing for years. And I'm building on those ideas and just applying it in this one case. And there are ideas in Marx about how you express your individuality by seeing yourself in the external world, through your creation. And so you have in the musical performance, and either in the performance or in the recording of it or videoing of it, you have people who now are proud of something. And for the first time in their life, in some cases, the people around them are jealous of what they've done, which is quite an amazing feeling for them. So that's the type of work I've been doing. I've been seeing some philosophical connections with this work.
That's very insightful. I've never heard it articulated like that, but I have seen it within music therapy, where it's interesting because you can give people with challenged behaviors or things more autonomy and agency through that, because you like you say, you're actually helping them along. You're not performative yourself, but by your presence and your doings or the laying out, you get this sort of performance. You see it in some performing arts as well, in improvised arts again, where that is where you're then actually part of the act, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work if you're not there, but it doesn't work without the other person as well. Okay. So it's only a complete thing with well, actually with the relationship. So part of it is in the interaction, not even in the whole pieces, which applies to both music and performance. But I hadn't made the leap into philosophy or even feminist theory. So that's quite interesting. Great. Okay, last couple of questions. One is, what does a productive day look like? Where do you get your ideas? Do you reread many philosophers? Is reading part of that productive day? What does that look like for you?
So there are lots of different types of days that most of them at the moment involve sitting in the same chair in front of the same computer for much of the day and talking into my computer, which wasn't part of my life until 18 months ago. But it depends where I am in a project. So suppose I'm in the middle of a project that's going reasonably well. And what I do is I get up early, I'm at my desk, 7 o'clock, write for 2 or 3 hours, and then my day is done. In a way that I think my work is done, my real work is done, then I can get on with things like
podcasts,
answering emails, podcasts. No, I mean, then you get into, I mean, it started early on for me. So when I first started work in 1986, there was only one word processor in the department, and no one else got in before 10 o'clock. So I got in at 8 o'clock in the morning and had 2 hours on the word processor before everyone else came in. And so in a way, I had 2 hours of pre-work before my day started. So I'd have an absolutely full diary from 10 till 6. I'd be writing for 2 hours beforehand. I've just got into that habit of being most productive in the first few hours of the day. So I work much faster. My writing's much more fluent. And I know that if I try to do more than about 3 or 4 hours serious work in a day, first of all, it won't be very good. And secondly, it will tire me out. So I won't be able to do it the next day. So I think the important thing for me when I'm in the writing phase is just to understand my rhythms. And that if I've done well for 2 or 3 hours, that's intense enough that I shouldn't do more. But I should do other things. I read, reread, tweet, answer emails, all of the things of that.
Is there a particular philosopher you reread the most?
So I'm more someone who wants to fill gaps. So at the moment, for example, I'm reading Tocqueville, Democracy in America, because I never have done. And I've seen many people saying what a wonderful writer he is and what great ideas he had, and so on, formed some very strong impressions. There are also some very boring bits, like in any writer. I'm going back to, something else I'm working on. You mentioned multiculturalism. One of the things I'm thinking about in relation to my new projects is nationalism and alternatives to nationalism. So people often contrast nationalism and being a globalist. You're either a nationalist or a globalist. You're someone from somewhere or from anywhere. Right? That seems to me a very, very crude contrast. And so it seems to me we form allegiances which are neither national nor the whole of the world. So we're members of all sorts of different communities. So I'm thinking of a view which I'm tentatively giving the title multi-communitarianism, as distinct from multiculturalism, because any one of us is a member of many communities, of which nationalism, our national community, is only one and maybe not the most important. So all of these things help form our identity, but also give a source of value as well. So there are so some of them are geographic, regional, some of them are not, some of them are intellectual. So we're part of the community of scholars, that's an international community, but also I'm someone who now lives in a certain part of London, I feel affinity for that and so on. So, and yeah, I never, apart from 1 year in my life when I knew I was coming back, I've never lived more than 30 miles from central London. Yes, I'm someone from anywhere. So I'm a grounded cosmopolitan or rooted cosmopolitan. So I'm trying to, the reason I'm mentioning this is that I came to this view through reading a number of books. And then I realized the reason I was reading those books was that they had all been mentioned in Anthony Apppia's book, The Lies That Bind. I thought, oh, have I just reinvented Appia's own view by coming through this? So I'm going back to read Appia, and I realized he's doing something related but different. So that's something I often do. And this goes to your other question: where do I get my ideas from? So my ideas are almost all. So I have this conceit that I'm better at explaining other people's ideas than they are. So this is one of the reasons why I write books for students, my introduction to political philosophy and my little book on Marx. I puzzle through ideas, and I find a way of explaining them. But when I do that with living philosophers, they never recognize the views I'm giving back to them. So I'm always changing and reinterpreting them. So they're influenced. So the views I have often are very influenced by people. And the fascinating thing is, quite often I find myself inventing views I originally disagreed with. I read something and I think that's wrong. And I think about it, and I go off in a different direction and come back. And then I realize that the view I'm now inclined to is something that I thought I rejected early on. So I react. But if I'm writing a paper or writing a chapter in a book, so this is going to sound very pretentious. So
excuse you.
Yeah. Okay. So I was reading something about Mozart. So it's already getting pretentious, and why there were so few corrections on his manuscripts, on his musical manuscripts. So for most composers, apparently rubbing things out, trying again. Mozart was asked why there are so few corrections. And he said, well, it's as if I hear it all at once and then write it out. And that's what happens. So if I do get an idea for a paper, it's like that. So I'm in the shower and the structure just hits me. I mean, yeah, it's not a symphony, it's not an opera. It's a 20-page paper and probably not a very good one, but it's just that once I'm starting writing, I sort of know what it's going to be. And I can work very fast. That's maybe why I write in these sort of 3-hour intense things. And I've pretty much got the whole paragraph in my head before I write anything. So what puzzles me is not fast writing, but slow writing. So I hear people who can only think they can only do a few sentences a day. I think, well, how is that working? How does that work for you? How do you know where you're going? And it's like having a conversation that when you utter a sentence, you know how it's going to end, but you've never formulated that in your head when you start. It's not as if you practice and then it comes out. You know where you're going, but it takes a bit of time to come out. So writing for me is a bit like that you sort of know what it's going to be, and then it takes some time to put it down on paper.
That makes a lot of sense. I have read and actually know a lot of creators who do that way of creating, that it is more formed. It might take them, to say it like their whole lifetime to get to that idea or what they fully form, but they can sometimes write it very quickly. I know playwrights who will write a whole play in a weekend, but it actually took them years to come to that. Or I sometimes say it's like, you might have a really good idea what it would have been like to have your mum stuck in a lift with Donald Trump. You could maybe write that very quickly. Maybe no one else would be interested in that, but you have a very fully formed idea in your head about what those two characters might be. But like you say, there are some people who write slower, and often they write because they are editing their sentences and their wordplay very much as they go along, and they don't shut off that editing brain, and they haven't fully formed it in a way that it's pre-edited already. But obviously there's a plurality of ways of doing it. And so last question would be, do you have any advice for perhaps young people today, or maybe people who are thinking about the relevance of philosophy or public policy, or just some advice for people listening today about what they should think and do in the world?
Advice for young people on what they should think and do, right? Okay. So I wasn't expecting this question, so but let me start in a almost negative place. So when I was in the philosophy department at UCL, I had a joke with some of my colleagues about some students who we said weren't really interested in philosophy, but they were interested in being interested in philosophy. That is, they really wanted to be someone who spent their days doing philosophy. They didn't really have it, so they had this desire, but it wasn't really part of them. I thought that was such a shame. They had chosen something that they weren't really excited by. They're excited by the name. They're excited by the aura. It seems to me that people should work out what actually excites them, what actually interests them, and do it. Particularly at university. When I used to do career fairs, I would love it when sixth formers would be there with their parents. So I could say to the students, choose something that really inspires you, choose something that really interests you at university, because you've got the rest of your life to be bored. So this should be the 3 years where you really make the most of it. Don't do something just because you think you're going to get a job from it. You're going to get a job, you might get a lot of money. There's not that much, depending on what you want to do, of course. You may already have everything worked out. On the whole, just find things. You don't have to. I'm not talking about find your passion. I hate this idea that people have to have a passion. But you can be interested in something, and you can find it fascinating. You want to spend your time for now with it, and do that. But at the same time, many of us are in a privileged position. And we do have responsibilities that come from that, there are things one ought to be doing, thinking about how simple things you can do can make things better and worse for others. I mean, it really pains me, for example, when I see ordinary people making life difficult for someone, serving them in a bar, or people just showing off to their friends by being a bit snotty to a waitress or something. Why? What's the point? It's just as easy. Okay, so I'm going to sound like some old vicar, or it's just as easy to be nice as it is to be nasty.
Be kind.
Be kind. I was asked on a podcast, another podcast, what are the 3 things that I would say form my view of morality? And luckily I'd been writing something similar, so it looked like this was just coming off the top of my head. But so the 3 things I said: first of all, be kind. Secondly, always try to see things from the other person's point of view. And thirdly, never forget the position of power that you're likely to be coming from and the effect of that. So that is, I suppose, my advice to everyone: be kind, Try to see things from the other person's point of view, and never forget your power or privilege that has put you where you are.
Well, that's a great insight. So with that, I will thank you very much. Thanks so much for chatting.
That's absolutely my pleasure. Thanks so much for setting it up and for your time too, Ben.
Thanks. If you appreciate the show, please like and subscribe, as it helps others find the podcast.